They fired my father over a lie. Today, I bought the company for $18 million. The words left my mouth before the silence swallowed the boardroom. On the screen, my electronic signature glowed like a final sentence. I turned to the man who taught me the value of a firm handshake and looking someone in the eye. "Dad, the CEO position is yours. Take a seat. My name is Michael Alexander Hayes, and this is the story of my revenge. Not a revenge of blood, but of memory, honor, and accounts finally settled. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, listening to my father, Robert, talk about ethics. He would repeat that profits without purpose are debts to the living, and I didn't forget a single one of those lessons beside the kitchen table. I remember the morning when everything crumbled, on a cold Tuesday in November. My father came home early with his badge cut and a brown envelope. He tried to smile, but his mouth trembled like glass about to shatter. "It was a misunderstanding," he said, shielding my mother and me from the truth. I was only 15, but I understood that they had broken something sacred. The company was Stratford Dynamics in Chicago. In the lobby, polished marbles reflected promises they never kept. The CFO, Gregory Cole, pointed to a non-existent embezzlement, a precise setup to destroy my father. My father didn't argue. He handed over the badge with the dignity that would teach me everything about life. He washed dishes at night, taught classes on Saturdays, and whenever I wanted to hate the world, he made me read about Lincoln. "Character is destiny," he'd say. "Love is discipline added to hope," and he mastered that equation. While my peers bought sneakers, I bought books. While they dreamed of cars, I dreamed of leverage. At 25, I sold my second startup. I mapped out Stratford from the inside, a web of debts and expired contracts, and waited for Gregory to blink. It only took one bad quarter. Today, in that room, I placed the contract on the table. $18 million, the price for someone who understands the hidden cost. Gregory tried to speak, but guilt weighs more than a tie. "Robert Hayes will be the interim CEO." My voice was steady, but my heart pulled me back to that November day. My father hesitated, his eyes welling up. "Michael, you don't have to do this for me. Dad, you taught me the difference between winning and deserving. Today isn't about revenge. It's about justice. And I promised, we're going to rebuild without losing who we are. My name is Michael Alexander Hayes, and though the world sees me as a cold investor, inside me still lives the boy who watched his father humiliated in front of an entire room. Power never seduced me for its shine, but for the chance to correct what a blind system destroyed. In the glass corridors of Stratford Dynamics, every step of mine echoed the memory of that day when he left with his badge cut. Now, people greeted me with reverence, but I saw fear in their eyes, the same fear they once had of facing him. Destiny is cyclical, and I learned that justice, when it returns, rarely arrives alone. My father occupied the new office with a silent, almost ritualistic respect. He rearranged the books on the shelves as if cleaning the past with his own hands. Sometimes I watched him without him noticing, admiring the calm with which he dealt with what was still rage for me. "Michael, don't turn what we've done into revenge," he said one night, looking out at the city from the window. I tried to smile, but inside me a volcano was growing. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking balance. But balance is treacherous when the heart still bleeds. The first months were a veiled war. Divided departments, suspicious advisors, journalists sniffing for blood. My father tried to rebuild the company's culture with empathy and ethics, but some didn't want to see Stratford reborn. They wanted revenge against us. I received anonymous emails, veiled threats, leaked reports to the press. I knew Gregory Cole was still pulling strings from the shadows, and the feeling that the enemy was breathing within the walls kept me from sleeping. That man had destroyed my father's name once. I wouldn't allow him to try again. It was during this time that Olivia Grant, my lawyer, approached me with a concerned look. "Michael, you need to choose. Either lead like your father or fight like your enemy." She was right. I was becoming a dark reflection of Gregory. Cold, methodical, ruthless. But how to be different when the price of justice is too high? I looked at my father,
head down, signing reports and treating everyone with the same respect he never received. He still believed in redemption, and I was starting to doubt if that concept existed in the real world. The truth is, he taught me to be fair, and I only learned to be effective. One night, when the building was already asleep, I found an old photo fallen behind his desk. The two of us, smiling, before everything crumbled. I held the image for long minutes, and understood that that man had taught me everything that mattered: dignity, courage, and love. But perhaps the greatest test was to prove that I could win without losing what he valued most: humanity. In that instant, I realized that what started as revenge was becoming something greater. I didn't just want to restore the Hayes name. I wanted to prove that integrity is still the most profitable investment there is. The following months transformed the Stratford Dynamics building into a mirror of my own internal chaos. Each floor reflected a stage of the reconstruction: contracts being reviewed, leaderships changed, old corporate wounds being opened and cleaned. My father had become the ethical heart of the company, while I was the strategic brain, operating in the shadows to shield everything we built. But behind the meetings and charts, there was something more human: the desperate desire to prove to him that I was worthy of his legacy. Sometimes I watched him in silence and saw the man who once was humiliated now returning dignity to everyone around him. One morning, as we reviewed the quarterly results, he looked at me and said calmly, "Son, I don't want you to win the same way they did." The phrase cut through the air like an invisible blade. For a moment, I felt the weight of every decision I'd made in the past years. I had lied to investors, manipulated information, and bought alliances in the name of justice. Was the line between redemption and destruction really that thin? His voice echoed in me. Revenge is an emotional loan with unpayable interest. And in that instant, I realized that maybe I was already owing more than I could pay. Gregory Cole was still a living shadow. Even sidelined, he had allies on the board and used the media as a weapon. One day, an anonymous article leaked details about my acquisition of the company, questioning its legality. I was summoned by financial authorities and realized Gregory was still playing. He wanted to destroy me the same way he destroyed my father, by tarnishing my name. But there was one crucial difference. I had something he never had: a man by my side, willing to remind me who I was: my father. He looked at me after the news and simply said, "Don't fight with hate, fight with facts." During the investigation, Olivia stayed behind me, tireless. She believed in me in a way that scared me. Amid stacks of documents and tense meetings, I realized something that went beyond professional duty. I was falling in love. But ironically, the closer she got, the more I pulled away. Love seemed like a luxury a man at war couldn't afford. My father noticed and commented in a tone of wisdom, "Don't isolate yourself, son. Success without sharing turns into a desert." He always knew that true power lay in keeping the heart open even when the world tried to close it. On the night the audit confirmed our innocence, I went up to the building's rooftop with him. The cold Chicago wind cut through the silence between us. "Dad," I said, "they tried to break us again." He smiled serenely and replied, "And we showed that what is true always endures." We stood there looking at the city lights, and I realized that justice finally didn't taste like revenge. It tasted like peace. And as he hugged me, I understood that this story wasn't about hate, but about love that survives time and falls. If this message touched you, follow along with me. Sometimes subscribing is more than a click. It's choosing to remember that good still wins, even if it takes time. The calm that came after the victory was just the intermission between two storms. Stratford Dynamics seemed to be reborn, but I knew that beneath the shine of the new campaigns, there were invisible cracks. The press now called us the Empire of Redemption, and employees saw my father as an almost mythical symbol of integrity. But success comes at a high price. It attracts both sincere allies and opportunist parasites. Little by little, I noticed strange movements around the board, discreet meetings that ended when I entered the room. The shadow of Gregory Cole still loomed over us, silent, patient, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I began to feel the weight of responsibility not just on my shoulders, but in my soul. The early mornings became long, filled with reports and decisions that could determine the fate of hundreds of people. In every signature, my father's voice echoed, reminding me that justice isn't revenge in disguise. He was now the public face of the company, the one everyone respected, while I was the strategic ghost protecting everything from the background. And ironically, the more the company grew, the more I felt I was drifting from the original purpose. I wasn't just rebuilding the Hayes name, I was losing myself within it.
One afternoon, Olivia entered my office with tense eyes and a dossier in her hands. "Michael, we have a serious problem," she said, her voice trembling. I opened the folder and saw documents proving that Gregory had returned as an investor through a foreign subsidiary. He now owned a silent stake in the company, a wolf in a suit, sitting at the table, waiting for the hour to bite. "He wants control back," Olivia added. My blood ran cold. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Everything we built, all the redemption earned, was about to be eroded by the same man who destroyed my father. I went to my father's office and found him reviewing contracts, calm, unaware of the storm forming. "Dad, he's back," I said, throwing the papers on the table. He looked, took a deep breath, and replied with a serenity that unsettled me. "Then it's time to prove we're different." Those words should have calmed me, but they ignited me. I didn't want to just prove. I wanted to win. He placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't fight like him, fight better." But in that instant, I realized that rage, even contained, still lived in me. And the problem with hate is that it knows how to wait. That night, alone on the top of the building, I looked at the lights of Chicago and felt that the game was just beginning again. Gregory wasn't just an enemy. He was the distorted mirror of what I could become if I crossed the moral line. And for the first time, I wondered if the justice I sought still existed, or if it had already turned into another form of destruction. The cold wind beat on my face like a warning, and the city seemed to watch me in silence. I knew what would come next: more power, more choices, and perhaps the final price of what I loved most, my own heart. From the moment we discovered Gregory had returned as a hidden investor, the atmosphere inside Stratford Dynamics changed in an almost imperceptible but constant way. It was as if every meeting had a second hidden agenda behind the words, every smile a curtain disguising intentions. I began to notice faces that once greeted me with confidence, now averting their gaze. There was something poisonous in the air, and I knew he was moving the pieces again. My father, however, remained calm, like a man who had already known ruin, and thus didn't fear the noise of the walls when they started to crack. I admired his serenity as much as it unsettled me. "Dad, you don't understand. He won't stop until he destroys us again," I said, slamming the table. He lifted his eyes from the report, his gaze steady but serene. "Michael, you believe you can stop evil by controlling it, but evil isn't dominated. It feeds on control." I fell silent. It was as if he always saw one step ahead, even when the world tried to blind him. Sometimes I hated that wisdom that reminded me how much I was still driven by pain. Other times I just wanted to protect him, even if it meant crossing the line he swore never to cross. Olivia warned me harshly and directly. "Michael, Gregory wants you to react. He knows that if he provokes you enough, you'll do something that incriminates you." She was right, but it was too late. He had already provoked me in a way that went beyond business. An anonymous email arrived with an old photo, my father being escorted out of the company 15 years ago, the same image the press used to destroy him. At the bottom, just one phrase: "Everything comes back, Michael, even what you try to forget." My blood boiled. That wasn't just provocation, it was war. And I was ready to fight, even if it cost me everything. I spent the following weeks preparing the ground, analyzing every corporate movement, and trying to trace the accounts through which Gregory operated. Olivia insisted we act legally, but I no longer believed in formal justice. Justice for me was balance returned, so I began using the same methods I had condemned in the past: espionage, insider information, strategic alliances with disgruntled advisors. What I didn't realize was that with each one of those decisions, I became more like him. And perhaps that was Gregory's plan all along. Not to destroy Stratford, but to corrupt me slowly until I turned into a version of him. One night, my father entered my office and found me staring at the financial reports with a distant mind. "Son,
"You're going too far," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're fighting a man who has already lost his soul. If you try to beat him on the same field, you'll lose yours." I looked up and replied, almost in a whisper, "And if that's what he wants, Dad, for me to lose myself so he wins." He approached, placed his hand on my shoulder, and said, "Don't give him that gift." It was the first time in a long time that I felt like crying. Hate can be efficient, but love is still the only thing that heals. Time passed, and Gregory began to move like the cruel strategist he always was. Without ever appearing publicly, he manipulated advisors, spread rumors, and let chaos do the dirty work for him. Suddenly, reports began leaking to the press, accusing Stratford of falsifying balance sheets. I knew it was a lie, but the damage was done. The stock plummeted in a week. In the corridors, I heard whispers, glances of mistrust, meetings that ended when I arrived. Gregory didn't need to attack me directly. He wanted me to doubt everyone, even my father. And in silence, I realized he was succeeding. My father tried to calm the team, gather the board, and show transparency, but the tension was palpable. One night, he came to my office and said, "Michael, we can resolve this with truth, not anger." But anger was already the language I mastered. "Truth doesn't pay the bills, Dad," I replied. He looked at me like someone watching his own son sink in a river he dug himself. "You're letting Gregory teach you to be him," he said, and left. I stayed alone, staring at the city through the window. Every light out there seemed a reminder of what I was losing, my essence, my father, and the thin line between revenge and justice.
The next day, I called an emergency meeting. Olivia watched me in silence, as if she already knew something bad was about to happen. "We're going to retaliate," I announced, showing a plan to buy and dismantle Gregory's shell companies, exposing his trail of manipulations. "This will compromise us legally," she said firmly. "You don't fight mud with more mud." But I had already decided. "Then close your eyes, Olivia, because I'm going all the way." It was the first time I saw her truly fear for me. Maybe because, in that moment, she realized the man in front of her was no longer the Michael Hayes she knew. He was someone consumed by the fire he swore to extinguish. In the following weeks, I became what I hated most: hired hackers, corporate espionage, strategic blackmail. Every move of mine toppled a piece of Gregory's web, but it also eroded a piece of my soul. The worst was seeing my father's look when he found out. He didn't yell, didn't judge me, he just looked at me in silence. "I don't understand," I tried to say. "I do understand," he replied. "You're winning the wrong way." I left the office without looking back, because if I did, I'd give up. Sometimes revenge doesn't shout, it whispers. One more step, just one more step, until there's no turning back. One night, I received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was cold and confident. "Gregory Cole wants a meeting. Tomorrow, alone." Olivia begged me to refuse, but I knew that moment would come. It was no longer about business. It was about closure. "Dad, don't worry," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm just going to hear what he has to say." He hugged me tightly and whispered, "Promise you'll come back whole." I wanted to promise, but I couldn't, because a part of me knew that when I faced Gregory again, I'd have to choose between the justice my father taught me and the revenge the world forced me to learn. The next day, I called an emergency meeting. Olivia watched me in silence, as if she already knew something bad was about to happen. "We're going to retaliate," I announced, showing a plan to buy and dismantle Gregory's shell companies, exposing his trail of manipulations. "This will compromise us legally," she said firmly. "You don't fight mud with more mud." But I had already decided. "Then close your eyes, Olivia, because I'm going all the way." It was the first time I saw her truly fear for me. Maybe because, in that moment, she realized the man in front of her was no longer the Michael Hayes she knew. He was someone consumed by the fire he swore to extinguish. In the following weeks, I became what I hated most: hired hackers, corporate espionage, strategic blackmail. Every move of mine toppled a piece of Gregory's web, but it also eroded a piece of my soul. The worst was seeing my father's look when he found out. He didn't yell, didn't judge me, he just looked at me in silence. "I don't understand," I tried to say. "I do understand," he replied. "You're winning the wrong way." I left the office without looking back, because if I did, I'd give up. Sometimes revenge doesn't shout, it whispers. One more step, just one more step, until there's no turning back. One night, I received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was cold and confident. Gregory Cole wants a meeting. Tomorrow, alone. Olivia begged me to refuse, but I knew that moment would come. It was no longer about business. It was about closure. "Dad, don't worry," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm just going to hear what he has to say." He hugged me tightly and whispered, "Promise you'll come back whole." I wanted to promise, but I couldn't, because a part of me knew that when I faced Gregory again, I'd have to choose between the justice my father taught me and the revenge the world forced me to learn. The meeting was set in an old hotel in downtown Chicago, one of those places that smell of history and secrets kept in thick walls. I arrived early, watching the city's reflection in the lobby's glass, feeling the weight of every step that brought me there. When Gregory entered, he looked older, but the same cynical glint still shone in his eyes. He walked toward me with the smile of someone who believes he's 2 moves ahead. "Michael Hayes," he said, as if savoring the name. "You've finally become what you always wanted to be." I replied coldly, "The man who destroys you? Yes, I think so." He laughed, that laugh that once destroyed my father. We sat face to face, and for a moment, everything went silent. "You know, your father was always weak," Gregory began, crossing his legs. "Too much ethics for the world of the big leagues." My fist clenched, but I kept my gaze fixed. "My father had character, something you'll never understand." He tilted his head and whispered, "Character doesn't build empires, Michael. Fear does." His words hit me like blades. I could feel the old hate resurging, pulsing in my chest, urging me to react. But behind all the rage, I heard my father's calm voice. "Don't fight like him." And that memory was what kept me in control. "You think you won because you bought Stratford," he continued. "But who controls the preferred shares? Me." He threw a folder on the table, documents showing a network of investors linked to him. "I can destroy everything with one click." I took a deep breath and opened the folder. His plan was ingenious, almost admirable, if it weren't so rotten. "You know what's ironic?" I said, handing back the papers. "You taught me to be patient, and it was that patience that made me learn to play better than you." I pulled a flash drive from my pocket and placed it on the table. "This is all I need to end you. Money laundering, tax fraud, international transactions. Your empire is a house of cards." Gregory fell silent for a moment and then began to laugh, a short, hoarse, defeated laugh. "So tell me, Michael, what are you going to do now? Expose everything and become just like me?" The question echoed between us like a verdict. For the first time, I realized he didn't fear me. He was studying me. "You want me to lose my soul, not the control," I replied. He smiled. "Exactly." In that instant, I understood the real game. It wasn't about power or money. It was about who would emerge human from this war. I stood up, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm not going to destroy you, Gregory. I'm going to let you be destroyed by what you always feared, the truth." I left the hotel, feeling the cold cut my face like a blessing. For the first time, I didn't feel rage. I felt peace. Olivia was waiting for me outside, her gaze anxious. "And then?" she asked. "He lost, but not in the way he expected." The next day, I sent the evidence to the authorities and resigned from the board chairmanship. My father received me at home, silent, and just hugged me. "Now, yes," he said, "you've won." As I watched the sunrise over Chicago, I understood what he meant. Justice isn't returning pain. Justice is returning meaning. And in that instant, the world seemed, finally, in balance. The days following Gregory Cole's downfall were quiet, but full of echoes. The press fed on the story like wolves before a carcass of power. Headlines splashed his arrest. Economic analyses dissected the collapse of his empire. And suddenly, Stratford Dynamics went from a symbol of corruption to an example of moral rebirth. I should have felt satisfied, maybe even victorious, but the emptiness left inside me was deep, dense, and no headline could fill it. My father watched me from afar, with that gaze that knew more than it said. He understood. Revenge, even when it wins,
leaves no winners. On a cold autumn morning, we went together to the old building where he had been fired 15 years earlier. Now, under new management, the place housed a center for innovation and corporate education. My father walked slowly, touching the walls like someone recognizing ancient ghosts. "Remember this corridor?" he asked, smiling. "This is where I left my badge for the last time. I felt a lump in my throat, and now it's here that you teach ethics to a new generation." He nodded. "Time heals, Michael, but only when we allow it." We stood there, side by side, without needing more words. Sometimes silence says everything pride hides. With Gregory out of the picture, the company prospered healthily, and my father became an inspiring figure in the business world. He received invitations to speak, wrote articles, and talked about purposeful leadership. Seeing that filled me with pride, but it also made me reflect on the path I had taken. I had everything: power, money, recognition, but nothing compared to the feeling of seeing him finally respected as he always deserved. In every interview he gave, I heard traces of his simple and firm wisdom. It was as if he was returning light to a world I had almost darkened with my own darkness. Olivia, for her part, stayed by my side even after I left the board. Our relationship blossomed amid the calm that came after the war. She said I seemed like a different man, lighter, more human. "You finally freed yourself," she'd say. "No, Olivia," I replied one day. "My father freed me. I just needed to learn to listen to him." And it was true. His love, patient and constant, was the antidote to the hate that shaped me. Sometimes I think my greatest achievement wasn't buying a company, but recovering the man the world tried to break and the son who almost lost himself trying to fix him.
Today, as I write these lines, I feel the Chicago wind beating on the window and remember my father's words: character is destiny. He was right. Revenge is noise. Justice is music. If there's one thing I want to leave engraved, it's that power is only worth it when used to heal, not to hurt. Life is a constant negotiation between who we were and who we want to be, and I finally closed the right deal. If this story touched you in some way, join us. Sometimes a simple click to subscribe is the first step to changing the course of a story, maybe even yours. 2 years have passed since Gregory Cole's downfall, and Stratford Dynamics has become a global example of ethical restructuring. Investors call it the new Hayes case, and business schools study the model created by my father. He says in his lectures that the secret isn't reinventing products, but rebuilding people. Sometimes I accompany him in silence, just watching the impact he has on people. Seeing those young people listening attentively to every word of his makes me understand something that time cost me to learn. Justice isn't shouting victory, it's inspiring transformation. And my father did that without ever needing to win through fear. Life for me went on at a different pace. After leaving the board, I invested in small family businesses, startups that reminded me of the journey that once began in a garage. Olivia became my partner and companion on the journey, and together we created a fund focused on low-income entrepreneurs. My father helped us, guiding young business owners with the same serene gaze that shaped me. Sometimes I saw him smiling discreetly, proud, and realized how much that man had taught me without ever raising his voice. He didn't need to win debates, he won hearts. And that was the greatest leadership I had ever witnessed. One afternoon, we were invited back to Stratford's headquarters, now revitalized and modern. In the main hall, a golden plaque had been installed, with the words, "Honesty builds the future. Robert Hayes, CEO, 2025. I watched my father read those words with tears in his eyes. "Not for me, son, but for all those who were once silenced," he said. The crowd applauded him, and I realized that that sound, that applause, wasn't for the victory over Gregory, but for the victory over the system that created him. There, before that tribute, I understood that our revenge had transformed into something pure, legacy. That night, when the event ended, we stayed alone on the building's rooftop that once was a symbol of humiliation. "You know we didn't need revenge, don't you?" he said, looking at the city lights. "Yes, Dad," I replied, "but it was revenge that brought me to justice." He laughed.
as if understanding that life is made of paradoxes. Revenge is a map, Michael, but only justice is the destination. We stood there, in silence, sharing a moment that didn't need more words. For the first time, there was no weight between us, just gratitude and a love that crossed the fire and came out whole on the other side. Today, when I think about everything we lived through, I realize that the greatest investment anyone can make is in their own character. Money buys companies, but integrity buys peace. The Hayes story stopped being about loss and revenge. It became about reconstruction and purpose. And if there's something I learned from my father, it's that success isn't at the top, but in who you become on the way there. If you've made it this far, maybe this story also reminds you of someone or something worth rebuilding. So here's the invitation, not just to subscribe, but to be part of the stories that believe good is still the best business. The success of Stratford Dynamics and my father's legacy had become almost legendary, but tranquility never lasts for those who carry a name too strong. 3 years after the turnaround, the company was growing at an impressive rate and attracting the attention of international conglomerates. That's when I received a buyout offer from a group of foreign investors, the Nexus Global Fund. The amount? Almost double what I paid when I reclaimed Stratford.
Olivia found the offer tempting, but something in me hesitated. There was something cold in that proposal, something too calculated, the kind of trap that money often disguises as opportunity.
I spent nights reading every clause of the contract, and the more I read, the more I distrusted. The fund had stakes in companies linked indirectly to old allies of Gregory Cole. It was almost poetic. Even dead to the business world, his ghost still haunted our steps. I showed the documents to my father. He was silent for a few seconds and then said, "Power never dies, Michael. It just changes names." Those words hammered in my mind. I knew what I needed to do. Protect the legacy the same way he protected me when it all began. With firmness, but without losing my soul in the process. I organized a meeting with the Nexus Global representatives in New York. The city seemed to pulse with the energy of those who breathe ambition, and that glass room on the 73rd floor symbolized the heart of modern capitalism. They talked about expansion, growth, globalization, but what I saw in their eyes was greed. When they finished, I took a deep breath and said, "You don't want to invest, you want to erase the history we built." One of the executives laughed, replying ironically, "Sentiment doesn't pay dividends, Mr. Hayes." I smiled back and said, "But it's sentiment that makes people work beyond what money buys, and that's what you'll never understand." I left that meeting determined to keep Stratford independent, even if it meant giving up a fortune. When I told my father, he just nodded. "You just made the most expensive and right decision of your life." He was right. True freedom never comes without cost, and integrity remains the rarest currency. Olivia hugged me that night, proud, saying, "You've become the man he always wanted you to be." For the first time, I realized my fight was over, not because I defeated enemies, but because I finally learned to defeat myself. Today, when I look at Stratford, modern, ethical, and human, I see in it the reflection of a cycle that closed. My father now gives lectures at universities and is treated as a mentor by young entrepreneurs. I, in turn, have become an investor in social projects, helping small businesses flourish the same way he taught me to grow, with honesty and purpose. The Hayes name stopped being synonymous with scandal to become a symbol of hope. And if this story found you in a moment of doubt, remember, sometimes the true triumph isn't conquering the world, but choosing not to sell it. So if you want to keep hearing stories like this, you already know the way. Just click and follow us. Time, silent and relentless, began to leave soft marks on my father's face. Robert Hayes was now an almost mythical figure in the corporate world, admired, respected, and constantly cited as the man who proved that ethics and success could coexist. But behind the tributes and lectures, I saw the fatigue in his eyes. "Michael," he told me one afternoon, sitting in the garden of our house in Lake Forest, "leadership is a torch, not a throne." He handed me an envelope with transition documents and added, "It's time for you to carry that flame." I felt a lump in my throat. It was more than an administrative gesture. It was the closing of a cycle. In the following months, we took on the last mission together, transformed Stratford Dynamics into a foundation for innovation and ethical education. The goal was to give back to society what the company had once taken: hope. We worked side by side, he with his serenity, me with the same determination I learned by watching him. Olivia handled the legal side, and everything progressed with an almost poetic harmony. One night, as we reviewed the bylaws, my father looked at me and said, "You know why it worked, son? Because you learned not to confuse revenge with justice." I smiled, feeling the tears come. He was right, and for the first time, I didn't need to fight against anything anymore. A few weeks later, we officially inaugurated the Hayes Institute, with my father cutting the ribbon in front of hundreds of people. He spoke with the same calm that always characterized him, ending with a phrase that stayed engraved in me: "Companies pass, but values remain." The audience rose in applause, and I, beside Olivia, realized that that moment was the highest point of our entire story. Seeing my father smile, I understood that he was finally at peace. Justice had fulfilled its role, and redemption now had a name, face, and purpose. If this story touched you, follow us. There are still chapters of hope waiting to be written. Winter arrived silently in Lake Forest, and with it came signs that time was starting to collect its due. My father was more fragile, but he kept the same sparkle in his eyes, that sparkle that disarmed the world. Doctor visits became frequent. And even so, he insisted on working at the Hayes Institute every morning. "It's not the body that moves me, son," he'd say. "It's purpose." I accompanied him, helping him up each step, and felt the weight of finitude creeping in. The man who once built an empire now walked slowly, but with intact dignity. It was like watching a sunset that didn't want to fade. On a cold afternoon, I found him sitting by the office window, watching the reflection of snow-covered trees. "Michael," he began, without turning his gaze, "do you remember what I used to say about time?" I nodded, in silence. "It doesn't take anything from us. It just teaches us the value of what we leave behind." We stayed there for long minutes, in silence. It was the kind of conversation that didn't need words. The soul already understood. Before leaving, he held my wrist and added, "Promise that the Institute will never forget why it was born." I promised, and that promise, sealed with the handshake, became the most precious inheritance I ever received. Not long after, on a clear March morning, my father passed away. He passed the way he lived, serene, grateful, and surrounded by love. At the funeral, hundreds of people came to pay tribute. Speeches were made, awards cited, but none of them could translate who he really was. Only I knew. He was the man who taught the world to win without stepping on anyone. When I approached the casket, I placed on it the pen he used on the day he reassumed Stratford. "Character is destiny, Dad," I whispered. And in that instant, I realized the story didn't end there. It just began another, written in the memory of those who learned from him. The months after my father's passing were quiet and long, as if time had lost its rhythm. Walking the corridors of the Hayes Institute without hearing his voice was like inhabiting an echo, but at the same time, every room seemed to whisper his presence, in the phrases written on the walls, in the photos of the first students, in the ethics lessons he so defended. I sat many nights in his old chair and just stared at the horizon through the window. There was an immense void, but also a deep peace. His love hadn't disappeared. It had just changed form, spreading to the people he touched.
As the weeks passed, I realized that the Institute wasn't just Robert Hayes' legacy, but a living organism of transformation. Young entrepreneurs arrived from all corners of the country, carrying dreams, ideas, and an unwavering belief in integrity. Olivia and I dedicated all our time to expanding the project, creating scholarships, mentorships, and social impact programs. One of those young people, named Ethan, reminded me of myself at 20, idealistic, impatient, and full of faith in the impossible. He said one day, "I want to change the world, Mr. Hayes." I smiled and replied, "Then start by changing what's within reach of your hands." It was during this period that I understood the true meaning of legacy. It's not about buildings, awards, or fortunes, but about the people who continue what you started. My father's absence became a constant presence. in every difficult decision, in every word I needed to measure. Sometimes before lectures, I closed my eyes and could almost hear his voice telling me, "Character, son, always start there." Today, when I see young people like Ethan leading new projects, I realize the torch has been passed. And as long as there's someone willing to choose right, even when it's the hardest path, the Hayes name will live on. The 10th anniversary of the Hayes Institute arrived like a milestone of something much greater than a project. It was the celebration of an ideal that survived time. The auditorium was full of young entrepreneurs, professors, former Stratford employees, and people who in some way were touched by our story. Olivia took the stage, presented the new programs, and then called me to speak. As I walked to the microphone, I felt a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. I looked at the audience and said, "This institute was born from pain, but it flourished as hope." My father taught me that success isn't what you conquer, it's what you share. When I finished the speech, I called Ethan to the stage. He was now a natural leader, charismatic, and had created an initiative within the institute that funded social impact businesses in underprivileged communities. I handed him an envelope and announced, "As of today, Ethan Miller takes over as executive director of the Hayes Institute." There were applauses, hugs, and discreet tears. I felt a sweet weight lift from my shoulders, the same weight my father once passed to me in the garden at home. Looking at Ethan, I saw the continuity. The flame that began with Robert Hayes now burned in new hands, ready to light paths I never imagined reaching. That night, as I left the auditorium, I looked at the dark sky over Chicago and felt the cold wind touch my face, the same wind of so many beginnings. I thought of my father, of every decision, every mistake, and every right choice that brought us there. "We did it, Dad." The city seemed to respond in silence, with its lights twinkling like a distant applause. I got in the car, took a deep breath, and smiled. The cycle was complete. And if you've made it this far, remember this: legacy isn't what the world sees, it's what time preserves. So continue with us. There's always a new story waiting for the right moment to be born.